Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Great Creators. I'm Guy Raz, and this is where I have conversations about creativity with some of the most celebrated actors, musicians, and performers of our time. And on the show today, Jason Sudeikis on the meaning of Ted Lasso. So if I asked you to name the greatest leading men on television over the past, say, 20 years, you might mention James Gandolfini as Tony Soprano, or Bryan Cranston as Walter White, or Jon Hamm as Don Draper. And all of them are anti-heroes, right? I mean, we watched these characters cave to their darkest impulses. And sometimes we couldn't help wonder whether we had that kind of darkness inside of us as well. Well, Jason Sudeikis' character, Ted Lasso, is kind of the opposite. The show, of course, is about an American football coach hired to lead an English Premier League soccer team, despite knowing nothing about the sport. And here's the thing about the show and the character. Ted is earnest. Ted is generous. Ted is optimistic, no matter what. And above all, he's kind. He's really kind. He's a character who, like any good coach, challenges you and makes you ask yourself, how good am I really? How kind could I be if I just tried a little harder? Well, today on the show, Jason opens up about where Ted Lasso came from and how he's able to be funny without being mean. Plus, what he's learned about humility from his very famous TV star uncle and the story of his rise from basketball player to comedy sports improv to Second City to Saturday Night Live. Anyway, before we start, this is what you need to know about Jason. He grew up in a suburb just outside of Kansas City, but his world was always a little bigger. For one thing, he had a close relative, as I mentioned, who was a very famous TV star, as you are about to find out. Plus, his mom was a travel agent, which allowed Jason to get out a little bit and see new places.
I mean, I've always joked that between my mom being a travel agent and my father having a subscription to Playboy, that I had like early access to the internet. That was like, it was like, and it also made me incredibly open to wherever we want to go, but probably less of a self-starter, because she would be like, hey, we're going here, we're going there. And that's a trait that my father has. But also whenever she would leave, because I grew up in a house where the mom was gone probably more often than the father, in typical situations. And she would leave an itinerary, like detailed of like, here's when the dance classes are. Here's where the basketball practice ends. Here's what time they got to be at school. Even though it was the same every day, it was written down this thing. And she was brilliant at it. Still brilliant at it.
You grew up in mainly in Overland Park, Kansas, suburb of Kansas City, and I know that your uncle is George Wendt. And when you were probably in middle school, high school, I mean, that was like the peak of his fame. I mean, that was when Cheers was the biggest show on TV. Did everyone know that he was your uncle? Yeah,
everyone knew his name connected to my name. Yeah, to a certain degree, yes, because I would say in third grade, Miss Erlinson's class, I remember him coming to speak to the school, and that was
he came to speak to your school.
Yeah, he just came, because he was in town. I have a few uncles and a few aunts, and yeah, Kansas City, smack dab in the middle, only an hour flight away from Chicago, where most resided. Although George and his wife Bernadette were here in L.A. or in L.A. I'm in New York now, but yeah, that was a big deal. But also, it wasn't like a sports star coming or someone from like I just remember Miss Erlinson being really excited, because she was, a grown up and Cheers, while, incredibly, funny and well written and well cast and all that, was set in a bar. And so most kids, we didn't get the humor, right? But I did have this sense of like the enthusiasm people had whenever he would come in, and he had a built-in salutation, like people calling him by his wrong name, like you walk in a room, people say Norm. People were always really, really excited to see him when we'd go out. It was pre, cell phone or smartphone, so it wasn't picture. A lot of times it was, people just wanted to buy a beer with him or just say hello. People didn't truck around with cameras in their pockets, so it was just about, hey, how are you? And he had gone to college in Kansas City, so he had, people there. He went to Rockhurst College for a couple of semesters, so he knew that town well too. And the barbecue, will get anybody, excited to come to Kansas City.
You were like an athlete as a kid, a teenager. You played high school basketball. Was there any? I mean, for most of your time in high school, and even in when you went to to the local college to play basketball. Would anyone at that time have been like, "Oh, Jason, he's going to be an actor. Like that's the guy that's going to go on TV and in movies?" Or was your self-image and kind of the way people thought of you was as a jock, as a basketball player?
I'd be willing to guess that people, certainly coaches, knew my high school coach. I think it drove him crazy that I was so performative. Like my style of basketball play would skew fancy, hot doggish, And when you sort of look back and you're like, wow, how did I end up in this job? Like, and two big influences were way my Uncle George, navigated, and my Aunt Bernadette, and coming through Second City, and my parents being enthusiastic to go see stuff. So being around it, and then seeing the way George and Vern kept their, humanity and humility and connection to the family and where they came from and where they're currently at, playing sports and having like a group of fellas who made each other laugh and joked around a bunch and yeah, playing in that sort of style, like never throwing the easy pass. I grew up loving, Magic Johnson, but also like Pistol Pete Maravich and, Bob
So
Cousy.
no look passes.
Yeah. If I could go through the legs, just cause I would do it. And, it would drive some coaches crazy, but I got to play a lot of summer league ball, where the stakes weren't quite as high as like, high school basketball where, you're trying to advance into a state, tournament type of thing. And you just didn't have a coach usually yelling at you. It was usually a guy that was about 5 years older than you, like to sort of like, and kind of loving it. That's sort of what AAU hoops was for me, was just the opportunity to sort of screw around in a fun way like that. Cause it was just, I practiced like crazy throwing those passes. It wasn't like I was only throwing them, at those times. I'd thrown more behind the back passes against a wall than, to any human.
So you were, kind of looking back, you were already kind of a performer as a basketball player, but you actually started to do improv in high school. Like you took a drama class in your high school.
Yeah.
What was it about that you thought, that's what I want to do that? Like, cause
I knew I liked it because I loved going to see stuff, and I have two younger sisters, so I didn't, part of playing basketball, and then eventually when making the transition to like comedy, if you will, specifically, I always had and tried to play with guys older than me, so that you were the worst one on the court. You had to play, keep up, you had to catch up. Same thing with like my friends that I ended up doing this thing called comedy sports in Kansas City.
And comedy sports is there are clubs all over the country. Mm-hmm. It's like a competition of improv, like kind of whose line is it anyway?
Exactly. But all done in fun. It's kind of like almost like professional wrestling in the sense that no one's trying to hurt anybody, no one's getting mad. Hopefully not. If your improv game loses to the other team, and it was a red team versus a blue team, where the Sharks and Jets. But prior to that, just loving to go see stuff. I feel very connected to the character. I forget his name. Maybe Mike in a chorus line. The song "I Can Do That." I'm watching Cisco pitter pat dun dun dun. Said I could do that. Now, it wasn't dance for me, but it was like, golly, that Sky Masterson and Nathan Detroit. That'd be, God, what if I had the guts to get out there and sing? And I never did. Not until much later in life. That being my early 20s. But yeah, it was a little bit that love of it, that escapism, that mentoring that. People like, whatever, Gene Hackman, Robin Williams, Tom Hanks, Bill Murray, Chevy Chase, Bugs Bunny, like watching these, usually, like any situation with representation, watching these men, Axel Foley, the character, Eddie Murphy, like speaking truth to power, like being smart asses, getting the girl, any of those things that a generation before felt about Cary Grant or Humphrey Bogart, et cetera. So I knew I was drawn to that.
You still went to college to play basketball.
Yeah, community college. Sure.
Well, still, but you're still playing basketball. So but that didn't last long. And you must have been kind of an oddball, like this jock on the team with these guys that you probably were friends with, but you also had this other life, like doing improv and going to improv classes. Yeah. And so it was probably kind of weird in a sense.
To a degree. I know, bless any of their hearts, people that have that hadn't had the experience with it, both it being part of a family, situation. That being something that, yes, I had family that worked in it, but also a family that was supportive of it. And my mom taking me to go see La Cage aux Folles, like a touring company or fan of the opera and stuff. If you don't have access to the arts, or if you didn't grow up in a home that access the arts, then yeah, it would seem like an aberration. It would seem unusual. But for me, it was all I ever knew. And my friend group was tremendously supportive, wonderfully funny, clever young men. I mean, that's 100% baked into the DNA of the conversations that we write on behalf of the players. And I've become friends with athletes. I've become friends with people in bands. Those guys and gals just ingest, media like film and television and music, and really have strong, creative, thoughtful feelings and philosophies and opinions about them. And, that's all from me having the good fortune of growing up with the friends that I did, at least gravitating towards them gravitating towards me. And yeah, the ensemble arts, if you will, improv, sketch comedy, making TVs and movies is not too dissimilar for me than, playing on a team. It's funny. Yeah. I have a knee-jerk reaction to your use of the word jock, because it's like, it has such a negative connotation. It's such like pushing kids down in the hallway or slamming them in lockers and stuff. And that's just not the way, I ever remember being, and certainly not my friend group. We were like, good dudes. And yeah. And then the day I walk into that speech and debate class, they called it forensics in the Midwest. And then I'm watching like this whole other group of clever kids that were also supportive of me being an athlete, and they were also a little bit, flummoxed by it. And it never, I always felt welcomed in both groups, and I loved both things equally. And then at some point, I remember driving through the lane in community college and getting hit in the face. And it's not like I'm like, Leo DiCaprio. It's not like my face is my moneymaker or anything like that. It's not like I'm a male model, but I just remember being like, what is the end game here, Jace? Like, are you just going to get hurt or something? And I did kind of lose my mojo for, driving to the basket or just the physical contact of it all. And it was at that time that I was already I was driving home every single weekend to go watch Comedy Sports every Wednesday night, to like an hour and a half there, an hour and a half back, borrowing a friend's car to go do rehearsal so I could do this, this transition from sports to comedy with this thing called Comedy Sports.
When you decided to drop out of college and move to Chicago and pursue acting, obviously you had your uncle George was a well-known actor, but did your parents support it? I mean, that's kind of a risky move, right? Yeah. It's very rare for people to like, I'm going to drop out of college and make a career out of acting and just try to figure it out.
100%. No, they were supportive, yes. I mean, in the simplest way. But I also, I dropped out. Then I lived in my parents' basement. I went to the local community college, like literally 10 minutes away versus, an hour and a half down highway, 69 highway. I bought a drum kit before a car because my mom was traveling a lot, so I could use her car a lot, so she would just leave that. And so I never had a car, and I guarantee you they were worried sick. I mean, I know I would. I know I'd be like being able to empathize with them better now, but I was just like, I worked at Blockbuster Video, I worked at a grocery store, and in
Kansas City.
Yeah, before moving up to Chicago. But then moving to Chicago, I lived with my grandma on the South Side. My Uncle George let me use a car that him and his family would keep at this lake house in Michigan, and then so I didn't have to pay rent, and I just had to pay for gas. And I worked at Banana Republic on Michigan Avenue, and I would just spend every night up in Chicago, because to pay for classes, I did interning. Like I'd work, in different places, and then you get to go see shows for free. And I would just go watch, 4 to 5 hours of show every night, like with incredible casts, and on the Second City main stage, or people that have been doing long form improv, or the Annoyance Theater, where they did really interesting outside the box shows. And I just was a sponge. It was any time that anybody my age would have been spending it in classes or at parties, in a college setting, I was doing it on the north side of Chicago.
We've had we've had several guests on the show who really got their start in Chicago improv. Seth Meyers and Ike Barinholtz and Stephen Colbert.
Yeah.
And I've asked a version of this question to all of them, and no one can quite answer. I can't, certainly. But why do you think Chicago has been this like wellspring of talent around improv? Like why should, because there are a bunch of
Yeah.
improv theaters that became really famous in
Yeah.
Chicago. And, I mean, Amy Poehler, all these people came out of Tina Fey, out of Chicago.
Yeah.
Well, Amy Poehler, New York, but
But I mean, started there. Grew up in the Boston area, then moved there. That's where you would gravitate towards. And I think, I mean, I'll try to answer I mean, I am extemporaneous. But I've tried to think about it myself too in the past. And you don't have the same pressures that you have in New York and LA. One, it's a little bit more inexpensive to live in. A Miller Lite would, back in my day, cost $3 versus $9 on the coast. So they're like, I'm sure there was a similar thing with milk, but like it. But I think it was. I always felt that it was about the work and not the journey and not the destination. And what show you on, what auditions you get, and that, like, those sort of pressures. And more so LA, like New York feels like it has like that artist soul, and they're connected to it. But Chicago has like this blue collar, feel to it, and that would be the only thing I could think of. And you're also in the to have something that's been around since 1959 and has all that amazing alumni, you carry those. At least I did. I felt not like I was trying to impress those people, living or dead, familial or not. You just wanted to honor what they'd built and try to add to it. It's the same thing that you kind of feel, that I ended up getting to feel when working on Saturday Night Live. It's like, oh, you're a part of something. And that's just Second City, but the whole city has it. I mean, the Goodman Theater, the Steppenwolf, where Mamet, wrote Sexual Perversity in Chicago. Like the city just has that experience that I think if the weather didn't get as crummy as it did during 5 months, 6 months of the year there, I think the whole world would live in Chicago. I think it's a remarkable town.
You ended up getting a part, or going to work for Boom Chicago in Amsterdam. We've had, as I mentioned, Seth Meyers and Ike Barinholtz were also part of it. You were there when Seth Meyers was there. It's this, to me, I still can't wrap my head around it. It's a Chicago-based improv troupe that started in Amsterdam, and this is really where you meet like Brendan Hunt and Joe Kelly and people who would you go on to form to create Ted Lasso with, which we'll talk about in a bit. But
we all met in Chicago at different times, but that was where we all like forged
kind of
together. Yeah, and because it's kind of like meeting someone from your high school after high school in a city that you both moved to. It's like there's an instant shoot there. Like we're English speakers at this American theater company in the middle of this interesting land for numerous reasons, not even the most obvious ones in a lot of ways. And and then you're performing with each other. You're on the same side of, whatever, you're doing. You're on stage together. And that forms a quick bond, just like a sports team.
I'm curious about what improv did for your brain, right? Because you didn't.
Me too.
It's not like you went to like the Yale Drama Conservatory, like Sigourney Weaver went there, or like you went to medical school to become a doctor. Like you were learning how to do this by performing. But I imagine that it's like kind of, because it's hard. You've got to come up with comedy. Because I've watched some of your stuff that you did earlier in your career. There's one that you did, Blind Line, that I saw, and it's very funny. You're just picking up pieces of paper that the audience is thrown on the ground, and you're just like performing a sketch based on that word. But to get to that place, right? I imagine you have to like rewire your brain in a sense to be able to think that quickly.
I don't know. I mean, I may have just been lucky that it just gave me the repetitions to do it. My brain may have already been, that way. And then I just found a place that you didn't get demerits and detention from doing it. They gave you, you didn't get paid really either at that point, but I just loved doing it. And I loved the people that did it as well. The majority of and just that type of energy being around. I genuinely think it has as much to do with the nature of the family I was born into and the nurturing that I got from the friends that I had and maintain And then it just came down to those schooling. Sometimes it's all vocabulary. It's like, okay, here's what
Yeah.
I do. And then a teacher's like, oh, that's called heightening, or that's called, finding the game of a scene. And you don't know that until then someone gives you the vocabulary. And sometimes the vocabulary is merely there to help you access that moment, that skill set again, or to make the thing that I would, say, it's kind of a broad term of it, but it helps make the invisible visible. It gives a method to the madness. And so, yeah, and you don't know. It's one of my favorite things about, and I don't watch it anymore, but I know early on, like American Idol, that, there's some, young gal from Oklahoma named Carrie Underwood. Oh, that's a good name. And then it's like, and then she doesn't know what she has in her. And it's one of the themes of our show. It's like, you don't know what you have in you until someone comes along and says, hey, you might be good at PR, Keely Jones, it says Rebecca
Right.
Weldon. And so I've had people do that along the way. And yeah, each job you get, you can't help but feel like that's someone, wanting you to do well. No one hires you to, like, fuck up. They want you to score, on their behalf sometimes, yes, but also with the understanding that if you were to do the right thing at the right moment for yourself, like, that's just a good feel that's going to go out into the universe, and that need not always be obviously in entertainment, but if you're doing something that you have a knack for, that you care about, you're not hurting anybody while doing it, then yeah, who wouldn't want that, for someone?
Tell me a little bit about what was going on in your life in your mid-20s, because you're back from Amsterdam. You moved to Las Vegas to open up Second City in Las Vegas, right? And you're performing there, sometimes in front of very small audiences. But I read that at that time you became really stressed out, like
Yeah.
anxiety and stress. Like what? I mean, it seemed like you were leading Second City there. So what was going on?
Yeah, it's a good question. I developed like a minute version of alopecia. I remember, and it's like, it's still sort. I mean, you're looking here, but it was like right on my chin, about the size of a dime. Like, hair just stopped growing there. And I was like, what's going on there? And I went to a doctor, and they're like, oh, we think you have this thing called alopecia. I go, oh, okay. How do you get rid of it? You can't. It'll work itself out. Well, where does it come from? We don't know. I was like, oh boy. I'm like, am I gonna die? They're like, well, you are gonna die. I was like, no, I mean, like soon. I know we all die. But and then gave me like some sort of steroid ointment to put on it, and it did. It eventually grew back white, and then it grew back normal, and then it would sort of move around every now and then. And I think that was like the body, like the way our cars, will the brakes will screech, like, or squeak,
Yeah.
it's kind of telling you, hey, take a look at some stuff. So I've tried to investigate it. I think maybe I was only supposed to stay in Vegas for 6 months, and then my girlfriend got hired. Her name's Kay. We were working together in Amsterdam. Then she gets hired, and then 3 months after that, 9/11 happens, and so now it's like, oh my God, like the world is ending. All that fear that we had, both from within, but then anything, depending on your news sources, what you're reading, and we were hearing that the hijackers had just been in Las Vegas like 2 weeks prior, and it was just like this nutty thing, and yet we had a sold out house that night. We did 2 shows that night on 9/11, and it kind of made you feel like it gave you a purpose, gave you something, to do at night besides just watch, CNN or something. And between doing that show and watching, Sex and the City, that gave us, space and peace and like a little optimism and hope beyond what we were all dealing with at that point. And I just feel like, that place really allowed for the reps. That straight out of Malcolm Gladwell, like it was 10,000 hours. It was my Cavern Club.
Yeah.
It was all of our Cavern Club. I ended up staying 2 years, 9 months, and it was life changing. And it was like beyond just going to college. Now it was like graduate school, because we had to earn these audiences. We had to found a voice, I think. And I think being away from the hub of Second City, Chicago, even though we would go back there because Kay was from Chicago and my folks would go up there for every Christmas, and we'd go check in and watch like the main stage shows and ETC shows and everything. It allowed for like just this, yeah, you almost beat the acting out of yourself or like the influences and sort of found your own thing. But yeah, I think all that stress and anxiety and maybe wanting to do more or wondering if I had more to give was manifesting in white blood cells attacking my hair follicles. It's like you see it all the time, and I was set at ease by realizing, oh, this happens more often with people, because I thought it was unusual. But then I started to remember, oh, in Mike Tyson, you'd see it more often in like, African Americans, because their hair didn't like lay over. So you'd see it in Rasheed Wallace, you'd see like a missing patch of hair in like, Mike Tyson, and those guys are a lot tougher than me. So I was like, okay, so we're all sort of dealing with this. And again, these are the small manifestations that we, kind of dramatize in Ted Lasso, whether it be Higgins, like his guttural sounds, or Nate's hair turning gray, throughout this, second season, as he's making this internal shift. It's these external things that your body's just trying to like, look at this, man. Hey, dude, like, take a look at this. And,
Yeah.
I didn't for a long, long time, but,
You were, I'm curious about, I mean, you were eventually hired, you were asked to audition, you were hired, not to be a cast member, but to be a writer on Saturday Night Live. And I'm right before that happened, I have to assume that you had ambitions, that being a Second City performer in Las Vegas was not the ultimate goal. Like, that you somehow wanted to kind of break through and have, an opportunity to do something on a bigger stage. Was that a cause of anxiety, in a sense, like feeling like I'm never going to make it?
Not really, not consciously. Honestly, it was always tiny goals. The fact that I was getting a weekly paycheck, and even though it wasn't a lot, in relation to other jobs in show business, but it was consistent. I loved what we did. I felt a great responsibility knowing that this was going to most likely be the only show that a lot of people from, on the West Coast will see, a Second City show. And we were doing, like, for the majority of my time there, an archival show, meaning we were doing like some of the best sketches. So you're doing old Chris Farley, Tina Fey sketches, Colbert and Carell sketches, and I just took great pride in that. It felt like wearing, like a Kansas, University college basketball, or like a Celtics jersey, whatever great, sort of a Yankees uniform. And I was maybe too much, in that regard. And that was a thing that I sort of, had to work through and learn and be more open towards, like, how do you help the situation, through. And again, I don't think I was excellent at it by any means. And but how do you help a situation without demanding more from people than they're willing or wanting to give? The SNL thing, it didn't seem real until Seth. Seth was like the first person from our generation that made it through. Prior to that, if my memory serves, it would have been like Horatio Sands and Rachel Dratch, who were like. They were like seniors, when I was a freshman in the, Chicago experience. And they were legends. I mean, they were like two of the funniest people I've ever seen. I mean, they're still hilarious, but like, that's who makes it on SNL. Tina Fey, yeah. That who makes it. And then I had the knowledge of all the people who were incredible who didn't. And so then so now you never think it's going to happen. And then I remember vividly Jeff Richman, who did all the music for 30 Rock, an incredible director at Second City, also the husband of Tina Fey. But for me, Jeff Richman comes out to Vegas, watches the show, and says, "Have you ever thought about auditioning for SNL?" And I was like, "Wait, what?" And that's, I mean, the metaphor I've used is the prettiest girl in school that you're like, oh, she seems so stuck up. And it's like, oh, really? Because she has a crush on you. She does? You're like, what? Because at that point, I think it's within any sort of comedy snob's, journey to dislike SNL. I think SNL thrives from that dislike to a certain degree. It certainly has more to it than just any one individual genius. And I think Lauren would own up to that too, because even it still survived when he dipped out for 5 years. You know what I mean? And yet I think some of that is people, it just set a bar. It was a bar for things that for you to like, dislike, have opinions about performance. And yet that again, that vibrates. And it's one of those things, you hear that about certain, football teams, football's better in European football. Soccer is better when Manchester United is playing well. When the Yankees are doing well, it's better for baseball. And when SNL's kicking butt, it's better for comedy. And at that point, I was like, I don't like them, and more importantly, they would never like me, and
Right.
then, I was proven wrong about both.
You had sort of the opposite opportunity that Seth Meyers had because he was hired as an actor, and then he became a writer. You were hired as a writer, and then you became a featured player on the show. In the 2 years before you became a featured player, you'd have bit parts now and again, but you were mainly writing for other voices. What did you learn about comedy that made you better at it during that time? Because I know that probably, I mean, you were watching people on stage, and probably you were thinking, I really want to be in that scene, or I want to be on the show.
Yeah, that was advice that Tina gave early on. Was like, don't write something for someone else that you could do yourself. It'll drive you crazy. And I remember following that advice until at one point I wrote like a Dr. Phil sketch, and for a fellow named Jeff Richards, who did a great Dr. Phil impression on the show. And I remember feeling as he was performing it, I was like, oh, and that was the first time I did it. And as with many things, Tina Fey was correct. And you sometimes got to leave the house and prodigal son and return and come back. But what all that did, getting that opportunity to kind of like, I got lucky. My first week, I got a sketch on. My second week, I got another sketch on. My third week, I was in like the monologue asking a question. I think my fourth week, I got to write a piece with Robert Smigel, like a weekend update feature. Yeah. So I had a heck of a run. And that first month,
for Justin Timberlake, and Jack Black.
Yeah, I mean, great hosts. That was the first time Justin had ever hosted, and he was like so comfy. But those Mickey Mouse Club kids are like, like 40s performers. They can tap dance, they can do magic, they're incredible. And then I went like Oprah Winfrey for forever. Like I didn't get anything on, but what I loved and still love and will always love is the rewrite room. Like when you get to take on, like I do it like a bad impression of a Maya character, a Fred character, and then just your brain clicks into those voices and you try to write for them, support them, and it's just, I love it. And you sit around that room, and you're kind of encouraged early on, like, hey, just listen, don't want to like be annoying basically, and I would go back and forth between the rewrite rooms of Dennis McNicholas, who was down on 9, and then Tina was up on 17, and I would get bounced around from both. And I remember early on, sort of mumbling a couple jokes, being like a little, trepidatious and shy, and then Tina being like, what was that? That's great. Let's do that. And then she'd, take her pencil and like, you're just like, oh, wow. And then you start to joke around and yeah, it was just, I just wanted to feel, helpful. I did the only way to get over the imposter syndrome that I definitely felt, especially because I was thinking myself more as a performer than here got hired as a writer. Seth was a freaking great writer from jump. So even though he got hired as an actor, I mean, he's, very, very special in that regards and had and he was doing that at Boom Chicago too, clearly. But yeah, I just was just trying to keep up.
You felt like
Same
that.
thing.
You weren't what? You felt like you weren't as smart or as clever as the other writers you saw in there?
No, I mean, I don't know if it was that so much as, again, it's the knowledge of all the people that had that job before that that didn't keep it, or possibly maybe I'd heard rumblings of them not liking it, and wondering, am I really supposed to be here? Do I really belong here? Like, can I really do this? Like, when are they going to sniff me out? I didn't unpack the boxes in my apartment, which I rented 3 blocks away in case they needed me at a last second notice. My partner and I, at that point, she was living in LA or Vegas first, staying with the show, and then doing LA to, for,
this is K.
This is K, yeah, for acting purposes. So I was, the job, I was, dating that show, and every joke was a child, that kind of gave you vitality and made it all worth it. And yeah, because he didn't want to just rest on, again, your laurels or the resume but it wasn't from a place of, it didn't feel from a place of fear. It's just genuinely loved it. I wasn't trying to keep up, and yet it was a remarkable group that I came into as a underclassman, if you will. But that only prepared me to keep up with the truly, truly incredible, generation I feel like I was lucky to be a part of.
I'm sort of looking at your kind of your career, right, up until Ted Lasso, which we'll talk about in a moment. But there's something that I think is really common. There's a common thread in how you perform, whether it's like Vance, the dancer behind Kenan Thompson, which is so funny, or you know, the two a-holes character, or playing like Mitt Romney. One of my favorite sketches ever on SNL was the Mitt Romney drinking milk and increasingly getting drunk off milk. It's so funny. But what ties them all together is your comedy isn't mean. Like it's not like Mitt Romney could watch that and laugh at that and not feel offended.
Sure.
Or like that it was particularly cruel.
Right.
And I wonder if that was conscious. I mean, you're obviously Midwestern. There's an earnestness in and in a good way in the world you grew up in. But I wonder if that was always conscious in your mind about the way you did comedy.
Not conscious. Not conscious, but again, having wanted to not just make people laugh, but be around people that made me laugh, leaves you open to. I don't think you can. Same way they say in basketball, you can't coach height. I don't think you can coach cleverness. What you can encourage people to do is listen. Listen. And people are like, how do you get to quick? Listen. What's the trick to improv? Listen. I like this girl. Listen. like just listen. And I think listening is an active form of kindness. Truly, truly listening. I mean, you do it for a living, right? There's the research that you do, but then there's also the part of you here that's open to wherever the answers I take you. Whether I forget your question by the time I'm done with my sentence and we're off on that thing, you're listening. You're here. Boom. You're in the pocket. And it's like that's what it's all about, And so by circumstance, that then makes maybe the comedy a little bit more, a little kinder. But I just, I always wanted to speak truth to power, like that's why I love Axel Foley. That's why I love Fletch. That's why, that's why you love John McClane, even though it's not technically comedy, it's like they're always fighting for the little guy, but trying to defeat the biggest guy in doing so. And yeah, I personally like that. Doesn't mean I can't be, snarky and mean and cynical and have opinions about, things, the work, and mostly probably my own. And I can't lay myself out, with some inner voice and inside my brain. But yeah, it doesn't motivate me to do it that way.
When you, it's a well-known story that Ted Lasso began as just a 34-minute skit on NBC Sports. It was this trying to promote the Premier League, I should say, pronounced the Premier League in the UK, the Premier League on US TV television, and you developed this character, this coach Ted Lasso, and he was kind of more like the a-hole character, right? I mean, he was this kind of blustering,
certainly in the first one,
obnoxious, but funny character. How did you tell me how you decide to kind of take that character and turn him into something bigger and actually quite different from what he was originally?
Yeah, I mean, originally the ad agency, a couple fellas called the Brooklyn Brothers, who were actually a couple Brits, but they were like, hey, if we're gonna have an ad company in New York, let's Brooklyn. They had envisioned the character to be a little bit more of hair dryer type coach, someone that yells and screams like a Bobby Knight or your stereotypical NFL coach, and I just wanted to do this a softer version of that. Just yelling and screaming just didn't feel as fun. It also felt maybe derivative of things that I just I'd played or and this was an energy that I definitely would have played joking around playing beer pong with friends, some version of this, especially after a couple losses and therefore a few more cups of beer, pre-COVID, of course, but and it shifted into a less version of a hairdryer, more like this, this bumpkin guy. But in that first commercial, we I dressed like Mike Ditka, with the polyester shorts and the orange glasses and the mustache, and which I had, and he chewed gum. That was and then when we got to do the second commercial, that's between the two, the fun, the enthusiasm and kind of the the part that wasn't a blowhard is at the end of that first commercial, he gets fired by Tottenham, and he's just kind of like, oh well, and for me, versus blame, versus victimhood, versus like, they didn't give me a shot, they didn't give me a chance, being mad about it. He's like, hey, all right, oh well. And so in between those things, had the soccer community not embraced the commercials, and they truly did. And if for any of them that hate Ted Lasso the show, it's their fault for liking Ted Lasso the commercial, because it let us do the second one. And in that second one, we're going to keep the story going, so we're already sort of seeing a narrative. And it was always my philosophy about like doing recurring characters on SNL. Like very often it's just about repeating the mannerisms and like using the joke structures. And yet I always like the idea of trying to keep like a universe going, or trying to, and they're very subtle ways. And the show doesn't necessarily lend itself to doing that. And I understand that, but it was just an instinct of a desire to do. So we did the second commercial, and it's like, okay, we're going to follow the narrative. He got fired, and he loved it. He was only there 3 days, and he loved London. And he just took it home, and he fell in love with the sport. And that, as you can even hear me saying it, like, was just like, opened up this whole world. It kicked open all these doors of just like, that's what it is. And so then he's coaching like this little girls soccer team, and yet he's having a great time with them. He's talking about their feelings, he's doing all that. And it's just, and it's sincere. And we meant every bit of it. We weren't taking the piss out of any of it, including football originally, including soccer, including American, football. None of it. It was all done from love.
And Brendan Hunt is in it as your assistant coach. And I've heard him on soccer podcasts, and he has incredible knowledge of professional soccer.
About a million things, to be quite honest. I mean, that's probably the closest, like element of the Coach Beard character to him, is that he is like,
he's like a soccer encyclopedia savant in real life.
Brown. Yeah. No, he is. And came about it, honestly, like, later in life when living in in Amsterdam at Boom Chicago. But he was as cynical as any American football fan about, what is all the 90 minutes, 0-0, what is this? Then fell in love during a very special time of Dutch football, and Ajax football. And when, like anybody that has, I'm sure you have people like this in your life, if you're not one of these people for other people, when he has an enthusiasm for something and he shares it with you, it is not condescending. It is not, I think, didactic, right? That's a negative thing. Yeah. It is pure joy. And we could just speak in metaphors about what I did know and what he knew. And that's where that's the comedy of those first two commercials, really. Certainly the first one.
Between the time that you sort of introduced this character, Ted Lasso, in 2013 to the time where it was picked up by Apple, which is 6 years later, was it clear to you once that very brief campaign on NBC was done that you were going to do something more with that character, or did you think that was it? Not
immediately, but then I remember being at dinner. Me and my ex-partner Olivia were at dinner somewhere in it must have been probably Brooklyn, and she just knew that Brendan and Joe and I just had a ball doing it, and that it was well liked, and you should do something more with that. And it's not like that idea hadn't crossed our mind, but I do remember that being, it's sort of one of those things where like, oh, I feel this way about something, and then it takes someone outside of you to be like, hey, you should do that. And the phrase I've used for years is like, someone is there, or something is there to help, get your baggage out of the way of your intuition. It just sort of like, so the part of me is like, nah, that only exists in that medium, and people only this. And the second she said it, I remember, dude, sitting there being like, and started just riffing on it, being like, okay, but why would he do that? Because I'm like, okay, at that point, almost 40. It's like, he must have a kid, and if he doesn't, because that must be part of the story, right, at that age. And that's just the conditioning that we have, just whatever here in the States, and just having friends back home that all had almost teenagers at that point, and here I was childless, like thinking, okay, but why would he leave? And if I'm going to play that character, he's coming from that spot. Well, maybe things aren't going well at home, and so he's taken this job to to like have some space, and that stuff marinated. And then Brendan and Joe came out to Brooklyn for a week, and we stayed at my house, and we'd get up every morning, drink coffee, go down in the basement, play pinball, then come upstairs and just riff on ideas. And it was a very prolific week, because we basically beat out the pilot, and then we kind of did 6 episodes and like a special. We were just modeling it structure-wise off the British Office, which I think is an iconic piece of work. And if you're gonna like at least steal its structure, like you can't, it's magic in a bottle. But like at least you can be like, okay, we can do this. This exists, and and we came up with so many ideas for episodes, and things that were that are in the show currently came up from that thing about, Ted, seeing Rebecca cry in episode 4. It was always at a gala. It was based on the real thing that happened to me. And I knew, because we always knew that we were going to show why this woman was hiring this guy to fail, we allow space for the empathy. Ted's panic attack in 7 was always going to be surrounded within a karaoke situation. It wasn't until we were fortunate enough to meet and then hire, Hannah, that it was going to be sprung by her. Hannah Waddingham. But all those things happened in that week. And so then it sat and gestated for a while, different things were being made. Joe was working on Detroiters with our friends Tim and Zach and Sam Richardson. And I was EPing that. Brendan was getting acting gigs. Olivia and I were having our first child, and doing things there and movie things. And so then it kind of disappeared for a while. And then Bill Lawrence steps into our life, or my life specifically, and with a project that didn't manifest there, but he was like, well, if you ever have anything, and I was like, well, we have this, and I had a stack of papers, a crummy first draft of a pilot and beat sheets and character ideas, and kind of gave it to him. And then once again, that's a dude that looked at it and goes, yeah, this is something. I was like, it is, we should, and then it was just a matter of, trying to write that pilot and with the 3 of us every day, in LA, I forget what year that would have been. That would have been I guess early 2018. Yeah. And then boom, boom, boom. Yeah. So overnight success for sure.
Slight digression, but watching that first season and the storyline behind it, and I know you've been asked about this, you can't help but identify with what's going on in that character's life. And obviously you're a public figure. Mm-hmm. And you've been through very public turmoil, because we live in a celebrity-obsessed culture where, normally if somebody has marital strife or challenges, it's maybe their coworkers would know, or it's private. But when you're a public figure, it's in the newspapers. Obviously, this character was written before all of that happened, but you've been through this in a public way, before. How do you do comedy and do your public work and make people laugh when things are kind of falling apart in your personal life?
Oh,
How do you compartmentalize those things?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. It's your definition of falling apart. Sometimes things need to fall apart so they can be rebuilt in a better way. It's like a bone breaking, and up to a certain age, it heals stronger, right? So, one has nothing to do with the other. They're the storylines were always there, and maybe it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, but I that wasn't intentional either. It's like it all stems from that conversation and just letting things exist. And one thing that when you live long enough, and if you're smart enough, I think, to listen to enough people, that we're all going through a lot of the same stuff, and parallel thinking is one thing, but parallel existing is alive and well, and that's really all we were I know I personally was tapping into. It was like, I don't anything that's gone on for me personally is probably still in the gestation period, and that Ted Lasso is like the destination that I arrived at through the journey that I'd had up to that point in my life, and so I don't think I've used, with the exception of and this is just my assumption, of being able to play a parent more realistically, more authentically, with the exception of that, the majority of it is all based on things that existed, as much of them prior to even, having the good fortune of Olivia being a part of my life. You know what I mean? So it's like, and yet at the same time, to your question, all of us on camera have received these, when we get approached, people will say to us, the show, saved me, and I've said this in the press, but it's the truth, man. Yeah. It's like, I will say back, me too. And people will laugh. And yet I mean it. Yeah, I mean it just like they mean it. They're like, I mean it. I go, I know. Or if they have something to say, I go, like some kind words. It's like, I'm being serious. I go, yeah, I fucking hope so. It's like, me too. And one of the neat things about the show is the quality of the questions that we get. And, I understand people asking us 1,000 times, have you had any horrible bosses? Who would be your hall pass? But the questions we get about this show, man, the stories are tremendous, and they're tremendous in their size and scope, whether it be someone that's decided not to take their own life because they're a parent and they're thinking about, what Ted's gone through and what the father's gone through, or people just being like, I'm going to be nicer at work, people in hospital rooms putting up believe posters, like all that stuff is like that, like that.
I mean, it's
that like in my personal life, who gives a shit? Like, it's like, that's it doesn't come from that. The show isn't made from anywhere but love. It isn't enthusiasm. It's.
I'm curious if that was. I mean, you mentioned like the believe. Like I know a very good friend of mine who's like super cynical, really successful and accomplished academic, but the show's just totally transformed him. I mean, just the conversations we've had. He has a believe poster in his office. I mean, somebody you would never imagine, just super. But there's something about this show that has resonated, and at a time that is unkind. We're living at an unkind moment in human history.
We have been for a while,
for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you saw this show deliberately as a vehicle to kind of do something earnest. I mean. And to basically kind of say, well, actually, the world can look like this if we. I don't know. I mean, was any of that part of your
not
thinking?
Conscious? Not until. No, but it all stems from the character and like, again, doing that second commercial and his reaction to having got hired and let go in a 3-day span, and him just loving it and taking nothing but the good things from it. Allowed for this, like, so if it all stems from the character, then like even those glasses, like I've worn those shades, in my personal life, those like orange ones for a while, and they're like the blue blockers of like, commercials of our youth, where it makes the blues bluer and the greens greener, and it is like a different version of rose-colored glasses, but it is that way of seeing the world and that way of viewing people. And I think we didn't sit down and say, this is going to be this is going to be that. But every time a joke would come up that was rooted in sarcasm or cynicism or apathy towards someone else's story, just cut.
You cut it out.
Oh, you couldn't even, they wouldn't even get typed. I mean, you try not to say no in the writer's room when you let ideas, and sometimes they get into a draft. But then, I mean, a few times some of them would get there. Like, like I can't remember one specifically, but I can't remember the content of it. But I remember there being a joke at Higgins's expense, like season 1, and it got as far as a script that we're doing it in rehearsal, and it was just like, what is that? What is that? Like, it's like, like I can't even think of a good metaphor. It's like, hearing a vibra slap and like, Mozart. It's like, wait, he didn't write that song, that sound, like that's not his. Yeah. And so and then it just got cut, and I think it was just rooted from. I can tell you the pure intention of the character was, by the time we were talking about doing it as a narrative, was to not play an energy of, because you're talking about 2015, you're talking about before, Trump came down that escalator, but there was all this stuff kicking up, right? But just, I didn't want to play a dickhead. I didn't think how could I improve on, if you just use David Brent and Michael Scott, which the energy of the first commercial would probably fall under that, like, sort of archetype. How was I going to? Those guys are geniuses. Those things are iconic, and they're from the same DNA. It's like that's bonkers. But then also on the dramatic side, we had all these anti-heroes of Tony Soprano and Don Draper, and we'd fallen in love with all these quote unquote bad guys.
But
Walter
nobody
White.
wants to be like any of those people.
But I disagree. I think it may not have been the intention, but like I Banana Republic and coming out with a Mad Men, fashion line would say that
Yeah.
you're probably wrong there, right? Like,
Well, I mean,
big,
elements of that,
yes.
but who they were, their character. Like, you don't aspire to.
Well, you pick out what you want. I
Yeah.
mean, yes, some people wanted to be, like get back at people like Tony Soprano, or have, a way with women, like Don Draper, or be able to hold his liquor like Don Draper. But I understand your point. Yes, but I knew I just didn't want to do that, and we couldn't add to that conversation. Like, I wanted to play something different, and I also wanted to play something where I didn't swear. Those were like the two lay-ons, and that lent itself. But those were all in harmony with this overall vibe that, yeah, I just didn't want to like snark out anymore. It seemed too first thought for me at that point.
He's such an unusual character in that he's like deeply rooted in pop culture and also highbrow culture too, but not in an obnoxious or pedantic way. Like, there's a lot of references to Nora Ephron movies, obviously. There's there's references to musicals
Yep.
and Roy Scheider, and not in Jaws, but in
All that jazz, yeah.
Right, exactly. And then, like lines, I was just like, listen, just think about lines in the show like, "You're more mysterious than David Blaine reading a Sue Grafton novel at Area 51. Like, it just might pass by." Or like, "I like my water like Kyrie Irving likes his earth flat." The jokes in the show it's like they don't just stop and land for like the they just keep going. Like, you don't stop and allow people. I shouldn't say loud, but you don't stop and just pause them and say, "Look how clever we are." They just keep going.
Oh yeah.
But I can't imagine how hard it is to write so much of that in an episode. So many of these references, like it's like you beating yourself up is like Woody Allen playing the clarinet. I don't want to hear it. All of these lines from the show, I'll hear and I'm like, wait, what? Like, how did they just the effort that goes into writing that?
Yeah.
All that stuff.
I mean, again, the good fortune of surrounding myself with and getting to be surrounded by really clever people. I remember first month at least of the writer's room, and I didn't know anything. I'd never, written on a show. I mean, SNL, yes, but not in a narrative. That's why Bill was so instrumental towards, getting this thing off the ground, because he understands
Bill Lawrence.
Bill Lawrence, yeah, because he in that that cliche of like he knows more about television than he's forgotten more about television than I'll ever know. He was one of those guys, and it was something that I'd said to my manager. I go, in like when we were doing Detroiters, sort of saying like maybe there's some guy or gal out there that would want to like show run this, that has made a good chunk of change, and they just want to do something small with like some nice guys, as I felt Brendan and I were, and Joe, and he's like, it's never gonna happen. Then I mean, and why wouldn't he think that? And then lo and behold, it happened. And Bill would refer to me as like a cheat code because I'm in the writer's room and I'm saying some of these lines. So then if I say it, some of them would just spill out of me. It's just a mindset. It goes right back to that skill set that I got to develop, or at least hone writing, do it at the rewrite table, except I'm writing for myself. But then I can do it with all the other characters. Because, one thing that I should, say is it's not that things in my life aren't the things that Ted is going through, but I think with many people that are in the same position I'm in with when they're making something, is that the elements of things that I've gone through and go through and will continue to go through throughout my life are also hidden, if you will, in other characters, right? So those things happen both for dramatic, narratives, but then also just the comedy of things. And then when you do keep your ears open, keep big ears, like Del Close would say, then you start to hear how Juno speaks, both on camera and off camera, and then Hannah, and then this and that. And then you just keep bringing those things in. So like those lines come out of from outer space, but then also from an inner space too, as corny as that may be, but it's the truth. And then, then it's just a matter of curating, then it's just a matter of picking which ones. And instead of going shots on goal, like boom, 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 3 jokes on every page, it's like, no, let's save it for a page and a half. And, the thing that I love about Nora Ephron or, Ron Shelton is that they and other people do this, but these are the ones that spoke to me. They always had buttons to their scenes. And so it keeps the narrative going, because as the cut happens, you're laughing, and that's better for television in a lot of ways, because, we're not surrounded by, a couple hundred people that might be laughing over that transition. Instead, you're just sort of feeling it, and it's bringing you to the next thing. I mean, same thing with like a twist, obviously, as well. But I feel like those are harder to write because you can only do so many of those a show before you're, snapping people's necks at home, being like, what is going on? But yeah, but I said the first week of first month, I was like, Ted's reference level is this room's collective reference level. And if
Right.
it was a thing that I didn't understand, then just like when I would, I'm a vessel for an actor or a writer or a director or a writer, it's like, I don't understand this line. What does this mean? Instead of trying to change it first, going, this is what it should be. It's kind of like, what does this mean to you? It's like a lot of times if people
Yeah.
articulate their point of view, you're like, oh, I never thought of it that way, and nor should I assume that I can always think of it the way other people have. And so that's where a lot of those reference levels. But as I said earlier, my mom would take me to, go see these musicals, whether I was
Yeah.
ready for their content or understood like the themes. I just knew the songs, that's all there.
It seems like, and not to kind of overemphasize or beat this with beat this horse, but it seems like, and I think this probably applies to a lot of people, certainly for me with what I do, but that in a sense, Ted Lasso is one of the benefits, I guess, for you personally is like it's like almost like a form of therapy for you.
Yeah. I think it has been for others too. I think it has been
Yeah.
yes, without a doubt, before I was doing it consistently, but it was, I think it similar to the hair falling out of my face or like having sciatica 9 months before and 9 months after having, my son, like it's one of the positives of something that you wanted and needed to come into your life and the people and experiences that it's brought into my life, and I know for a fact I'm not alone in that, of the people that have in every aspect of the show have felt, and what's lovely, it's a lot of times it's from within. All this, reaction to it and people's response to it is nothing you sit at a keyboard thinking that would happen. And in a lot of ways, maybe elements of it after you've experienced it would ever want to happen, because it's a great, responsibility. And yet we came about it as sincerely and authentically as I think you could come to something that resonates this way,
I'm curious about that word responsibility and the responsibility of that character, because you mentioned when you were a kid, people would see your Uncle George and they'd say Norm, and to some extent that may happen to you and certainly will happen to you for a long time, where people will see you as Ted, right?
Yeah, or coach,
and
which is hilarious.
coach.
I wonder if doctors from Grey Anatomy have that doc. Hey, doc,
Right.
It's like, but yeah.
And he is he's an aspirational person. Like we all want to be a version of him because he's the best version of what we hope to be. But like it also means you can't be an asshole like you always had. I mean, I don't know. I wonder, like, do you feel like in a sense you have to represent this guy in real life too?
I think that, after season 1, people ask, are you like Ted? Or you like, and it's a hard question to answer because people put a lot of different things on what Ted is. I'm like, yeah, I'm a lot like Ted, but I think the thing that people are responding to and maybe asking me about if I'm like that, I think we all have it in us, and then sometimes it got beat out of us or, tricked out of us or we're hiding it to keep ourselves from not being hurt, that maybe in a way that Ted's openness and vulnerability, which I don't think is carte blanche, I think he's still, I think people have sniffed out like the toxic positivity and all that and him not taking care of himself. But as I mentioned earlier, people walk up to any of us on the show with such enthusiasm, but also such like sincerity and kindness and grace. And those are elements that, again, we didn't have these words up on the, this is what the show's about, grace, forgiveness. It just, when the choices come to make for characters, just where they would gravitate, like episode 9, that first season, it's not, it didn't seem to me to be a plot point that Ted was going to forgive Rebecca. It's like, let's just get that out of the way, man. It's about her. Ted hadn't done anything wrong to her. It's about her forgiving Higgins, who used to sneak fucking Rupert's girls in, because he was scared about losing his job. And he's got a family of, 6. He's got 5 boys and a wife that he loves, and he doesn't want to lose his gig. And so he had to play the game. And he hates himself for it. Go forgive that dude. Take what Ted, did and like let yourself off the hook, young lady. And so it's a responsibility in the sense that it reminds me of that part of myself that that is innate to this character that I think again is in all of us, that meet people where they see you. I have, I've had the good fortune of being quote unquote, a public person for a while, just having worked at a place like SNL, which, there's no classes for fame, and yet it is an incredible place to watch the intoxications and just toxicity of new fame. And so I'm glad that this moment in my life, this creative sort of, career moment happened at this point in my life and not early on, I don't think I've been able to write it or play it, get out of my way enough to like allow the things that sort of that were delivered almost, from somewhere else, in aspects to the creation of this show. But it also just allows for just sitting with people. But I would always return. I always felt like return the energy that you're given. So sometimes people are a little, maybe if it's later, they're turning the lights on in the bar and people are a little bit more, tossing elbows or coming out with the phone already. And they just want to take something from you versus, having you become a prop and not a human being. Then you sort of deal with that differently, but I'd still deal with it, I guess, in my mind unconsciously like Ted. And I wouldn't, just, it's not a put on. It's just nice. And what I truly like, am in like I find inspiring is the opportunity to, when people ask, questions about it or want to know something about it or want to share a story, it allows me to just sit in the present with them. And that's something that I would have always done, but I wouldn't have received the same energy prior to this show. It was never bad, but it was always, it wasn't quite as focused as it is now.
Do you think that the natural sort of life cycle of the show ends with season 3? That maybe even with all of its success and love and fan base, that maybe this is it?
That's the way we conceived it, and whether it was, just going back to that modeling of the 6 episodes Christmas special, and it's not like it was all written out. It's not like we had 34 scripts and we were just hiring people to, shut up and say the words, just show up and, here's, it was a feel, it was an arc specifically for Ted, that I don't know how it would feel to not honor that story. Not because it was the one that we had, but because of the one that it is, if that makes any sense. And so I'm sitting here with this knowledge of what this is. And look, man, it's not Citizen Kane. It's not, it's not Casablanca. It's not Moonlight. It's not like this seminal. It doesn't feel like a seminal work to me, nor do I expect people to view it that way. But it is what it is. And we were very lucky to get it, allow it to be what it was supposed to be. And it would feel, knowing how it ends in this iteration, it would feel very cynical to have it immediately, and we're back, that'll make more sense when folks see it, I think. And if it doesn't, they'll at least hopefully allow the space to empathize with how those of us that know the story, where it should go. But yeah, man, I can't. I'm flattered. We're all flattered by the enthusiasm folks have for a 4th season, and yet it also is kind of hilarious that from the second we all flew from the UK to LA, and had the good fortune of winning the Emmy again, that those questions started about, okay, so we're here celebrating season 2. We're in the midst of shooting season 3. What about season 4? I'm like, if that's not the most anti-Ted Lasso fucking question, you know what I mean? If Ted Lasso is a metaphor for mushrooms, and mushrooms are just this thing that the gods gave us to be present in the moment with nature and in one another and the nature within ourselves, what about this thing? And I get it, and I'm cool with it, and I appreciate the question in every way it's come at us. But yeah, there's no secret that we're not withholding, and we're gonna spring season 4 on you like Renaissance, where it's just just shows up on your Apple TV Plus. that I know of.
I hesitate to ask this question, but I think it is important, and it's the last question I'll ask you, which is because people have an accomplishment. People say, well, "What's next?" Which is I hate that
Yeah.
question because it's like, "What do you mean, what's next? I'm just finishing this
I know,
thing." But
yeah.
obviously, this is done. I mean, season 3 is wrapped up, and now you are enjoying the fruits of
Well,
that.
we're editing
But
still to be.
oh, yeah,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
I got you. Okay, what do you want to do? I mean, this character is so iconic,
Hmm.
and he is so associated with you, but you've also been like that guy in Booksmart, the principal and driving the Uber, and like you've played a bunch of different characters. Do you imagine developing a brand new show with a brand new character? I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, no BS. I haven't allowed myself the time to. I haven't been granted the time, to be quite honest with you. It's been go go go. I mean, that's part of the reason why it's hard to talk about season 4 is because people like. I know people love sitting down and watching it. People love, showing up to work and saying the lines, and people, it's we do things in a different, exciting. I mean, so many of our directors come in and like, this reminds me of, film school, like, and we're not making stuff up as we go, but sometimes the scripts will shift based on a rehearsal, like I mentioned earlier, like about that Higgins sort of, sarcasm joke. But so I just haven't sat with it. I think another reason why the show is the way it is because of all this time that it took to marinate. Now, it doesn't mean I'm going to take 39 years or whatever this thing started to come up with another one. There's all sorts of ideas, but I have to get out of this universe first. I see all these guys, and I feel like we haven't seen each other since the show wrapped. During this press week, the last couple weeks, but I'm with them every single day. I'm with and I'm like they're seeing me. Oh my gosh, how you doing? Look, you got a beard. I was like, oh yeah, right. It's like, and I see them every day, and they make me laugh and cry every day. And that's just the cast, And then occasionally, like on a daily, you'll see, a boom operator or a director. You hear their voice in the back, and I'm still with them. And so I can't think about what's next. I can't be on this date with all of them, and think about some, booty text, I'm going to send or receive after the moment. That's just not. It's not the way I can live my life. I got trying to land this plane, and then trying to make sure Otis and Daisy have enough fuel in their own planes to to take off and land wherever and they're doing a lot more starting and stopping than me. This allows for a little bit of autonomy to make that decision, but I also have no interest in like sitting in it and like getting stuck in my own like oh God, how do you follow that? It's like I don't feel that either, luckily. And so, yeah, I wish I had I wish I had an answer for you, but I'm also glad that I don't, not even in a cute way, because I think that's the way I have to, go about it for right now. But, again, flattered by the curiosity.
Jason, thank you so much.
No, man, thank you very much. This was really, really neat, and I, love your questions.
Hey, thanks so much for watching my interview with Jason Sudeikis here on The Great Creators. For more episodes like this one on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button below this video. And if you want to get notified when we post a new video, just click the bell button as well. You can also find out a lot more about our podcast and these videos by going to thegreatcreators.com. We post show notes. We've got interviews with Stephen Colbert and Bjork and amazing people on that channel. Go check it out. Keenan Thompson. I'm Guy Raz. You've been watching The Great Creators. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and we will see you here next time.